calm criminal.
I first came across the Antwerp Diamond Heist in the same way I imagine most people do. Late at night, half awake, clicking through things I absolutely didn't need to know but somehow couldn't ignore. 1 minute, it was a perfectly sensible article about locks, and the next I was staring at a sentence that read, with baffling calm, that someone had once walked out of the most secure diamond vault on earth with hundreds of millions of pounds worth of stones without using guns, violence or explosions, and had almost got away with it if not for, of all things, a discarded sandwich. That sort of detail sticks with you. Antwerp, if you've never been, is a place that looks like it should be quietly important rather than globally critical. It's handsome, tidy, slightly reserved. You can walk down certain streets and not realise you're standing at the gravitational centre of the diamond trade, where an estimated 80% of the world's rough diamonds pass through at some point, like a highly polished circulatory system. Billions move through the city, not in armoured convoys, but in briefcases, in coat pockets, in little folded parcels that look laughably unremarkable. And at the heart of it all, in the Diamond District, sat the Antwerp Diamond Centre. Underground, concrete, steel, sensors on sensors on sensors. The kind of place designed by people who don't lose sleep over aesthetics, but do over contingencies. Fire, heat, vibration, sound, magnetic fields. If you could think of a way to break in, they'd already thought of a way to notice you thinking about it. The vault itself was protected by a door that looked less like something you'd open and more like something you'd surrender to. A circular slab of steel, the sort that inspires confidence simply by existing. Inside were 189 safe deposit boxes, each one belonging to a different diamond merchant, each one containing stones worth more than most people will earn in a lifetime, or several lifetimes, if we're being honest. And on the night of the 5th of February 2003, someone opened it all up and helped themselves. No alarms, no guards alerted, no dramatic chase through moonlit streets. Just a quiet, methodical theft carried out over several hours in a building designed to make quiet and methodical functionally impossible. That's the part that bothers me, in a good way. Because this wasn't a crime of impulse. Nobody woke up that morning and thought, you know what? I fancy having a crack at the most secure diamond vault in the world. This was the end point of years of planning, reconnaissance, false starts, favours, compromises, and probably a few moments where someone involved stared at a ceiling at 3 in the morning and wondered whether this had all gone a bit far. The man who would later become the face of the heist, though I suspect he never wanted that role, was an Italian named Leonardo Notarbartolo. He had the sort of face that tells you very little at first glance. Not menacing, not especially charming, the kind of person you might sit next to on a train and never remember 5 minutes later, which, in his line of work, is a form of genius. Notarbartolo had been in Antwerp for years before the heist, posing as a diamond dealer, not a big one, just plausible enough. He rented office space in the Diamond Centre itself, which is the sort of detail that sounds outrageous until you realise that this is exactly how these places function. Trust is currency, Appearances are everything. If you look like you belong, people tend not to ask why you're there. For years, he played the part. He paid rent. He drank coffee with the right people. He learned the rhythms of the building. Who came in early, who stayed late, who cut corners, who didn't. He watched guards change shifts. He listened. He waited. And this, for me, is where the story starts to turn from an impressive robbery into something almost meditative. Because the real crime here wasn't the theft of diamonds. It was the theft of certainty. The slow, deliberate dismantling of a system built on the idea that it could not be dismantled. The group Nota Bartolo worked with would later be nicknamed the School of Turin, which sounds quaint, almost wholesome, until you realize it refers to a loose collective of Italian thieves who treated burglary the way other people treat engineering. They studied, they practiced, they shared techniques. They believed that any system, no matter how complex, was ultimately designed by a human being, and therefore could be understood by one. What they didn't believe in was luck. Every security feature of the vault was addressed one by one. There was an infrared heat sensor that could detect the body heat of an intruder. They countered it with sheets of polystyrene. A magnetic field sensor on the door neutralized a seismic sensor designed to detect drilling or vibration, pacified with something so mundane it's almost insulting, a layer of foam. There was even a radar system inside the vault itself, designed to notice movement. That one, apparently, required a bit more finesse, movement that was too slow to register, thus patience to freeze, sometimes for long minutes, mid-action, waiting for the system to reset. Try to imagine that. Underground, surrounded by walls full of diamonds, knowing that one wrong move, one careless breath, could trigger an alarm that would end everything instantly, and still choosing to move slowly, carefully, almost tenderly. This wasn't bravado. This was restraint. On the night itself, the team entered the building using keys. Real ones. No smashed windows. No forced doors. They worked their way down into the vault and spent hours opening safe deposit boxes. Not all of them. Just the ones they could access quickly. They didn't rush. They didn't panic. They filled bags with diamonds, gold, cash. An estimated value anywhere between 100 million and $500 million, depending on who you ask and how dramatic they're feeling. And then they left. They walked out into the night carrying the sort of wealth that rewrites lives, and for a brief, intoxicating window of time, they had actually beaten the system. The vault was discovered the next morning, gutted, humiliated. The global diamond trade reeled. Insurance companies had palpitations. Security experts quietly revised their beliefs about what impossible meant. And if the story ended there, it would already be remarkable. But it didn't, because perfection, as it turns out, is fragile, and the smallest mistakes don't announce themselves as such. They look like nothing at all. A moment of carelessness, a lazy decision, rubbish thrown away where it shouldn't have been. A sandwich wrapper. Nota Bartolo, driving out of Antwerp, stopped in a nearby woodland and dumped evidence. Burnt documents, packaging, bits and pieces he believed were untraceable, The kind of cleanup that feels sensible when you're exhausted and wired, and probably convinced you've just outsmarted everyone who ever tried to stop you. What he didn't account for was a local man walking his dog, who noticed something odd in the undergrowth and alerted the police. And from that unglamorous discovery, a bin bag full of half-destroyed debris, the entire case began to unravel. DNA, fingerprints, CCTV, slowly, methodically, the same way the heist itself had been planned. Notar Bartolo was arrested. He was convicted, sentenced to 10 years. He served about half. The diamonds, however, were never recovered. Not the bulk of them. They'd already melted back into the bloodstream of the global trade. Unrecognizable, anonymous, doing what diamonds have always done best, disappearing in plain sight. And that's the part that keeps me coming back. Because for all the talk of masterminds and mistakes, what really lingers is the idea that for one night, a small group of people understood a system better than the people who built it. They didn't break it with force. They listened to it, learned its habits, exploited its assumptions. There's something unsettling about that. Comforting too, depending on your temperament. Whenever I read about the Antwerp Vault now, I don't picture steel or alarms or technology. I picture time, years of it, passing quietly, being spent deliberately by people who were willing to wait. And I picture that sandwich wrapper sitting in the woods, glowing like a tiny moral lesson nobody asked for. Because even the most elegant crimes, it turns out, still have to deal with rubbish. Once the rubbish was found, the myth of the perfect crime began to fray, but not in the dramatic way people tend to imagine. There was no sudden montage of detectives snapping photographs and shouting orders. It was quieter than that, bureaucratic, a slow, slightly tedious process of cataloguing what had been pulled from the woods, half-burnt documents, melted plastic, food packaging, cassette tapes, gloves, the kind of detritus that only looks meaningful in hindsight. The Belgian police, to their credit, understood immediately that this wasn't a smash and grab gone wrong. You don't accidentally rob the Antwerp Diamond Centre. You don't stumble into it, so they treated the evidence with a kind of wary respect, like archaeologists handling fragments of something they didn't fully understand yet. Among the debris were documents linked to diamond dealers, including Notar Bartolo. That alone wasn't damning. He was meant to be there after all, but it was enough to focus attention. CCTV footage was reviewed, not for dramatic break-ins, but for patterns. Who was coming and going at odd hours? Who looked comfortable in places where most people moved with a bit more deference? And Notar Bartolo did look comfortable. That was the problem. When police searched his office, they found more than they expected. Tools, materials, evidence that suggested not just involvement, but intimacy with the vault's security systems. This wasn't someone guessing. This was someone who knew. During questioning, Notar Bartolo maintained his innocence with a steadiness that feels rehearsed only if you want it to. He didn't panic. He didn't over-explain. He denied everything, calmly, methodically, even after conviction, he would insist that he'd been framed, that he'd been a convenient fall guy, that the real architects were shadows still out there. And here's where the story gets interesting again, because he might not be entirely wrong. The School of Turin, despite the nickname, was never a formal gang. No hierarchy, no matching jackets, just a loose constellation of specialists. One man good with alarms, another with locks, another with logistics, another with patience. People who came together for specific jobs and then drifted apart again, carrying their knowledge with them like a private library. That structure makes them maddeningly difficult to pin down. Arrest one, and you don't collapse the whole thing. You just lose a limb. The body adapts. Investigators believed there were at least 5 people involved in the Antwerp heist. Possibly more. Only Nota Bartolo ever stood trial. The others faded back into anonymity, which is either proof of their brilliance or a reminder that crime, like most things, rewards the people who keep their mouths shut. What fascinates me is how little we actually know about them as individuals. No manifestos, no grand speeches, just fragments, skills, preferences, a belief system built not on chaos, but on order. They didn't hate the diamond trade. They studied it. They respected it in their own way. They understood its rituals, its blind spots. They knew that in a world obsessed with visible security, cameras, guards, steel doors, the real vulnerabilities are often procedural, human, boring. Take the safe deposit boxes themselves. Each one had its own lock, requiring a key held by the owner. But inside the vault, there were master keys, backup systems, ways for authorized staff to access boxes under specific circumstances, layers of trust built on the assumption that nobody with access would ever abuse it. That assumption is doing a lot of heavy lifting. The heist forced an uncomfortable reckoning within the industry, not just about security, but about culture. Antwerp had operated for decades on a kind of gentleman's agreement. Deals made over handshakes, enormous values moved with minimal documentation. Discretion was everything. Transparency was optional. And here came a group of men who exploited that discretion ruthlessly. After the theft, security across the district tightened almost overnight. New systems, new protocols, less trust, more paperwork. The diamond world didn't so much change as harden, like a scar forming over a wound everyone preferred not to talk about. But the wound was there. Nota Bartolo, sitting in prison, gave interviews that only deepened the mystery. He spoke obliquely. He hinted at others without naming them. He framed himself as a minor player, a pawn. Whether that was self-delusion, strategy, or truth depends on how generous you're feeling. He also spoke about the heist not with pride, but with something closer to irritation, as though the real injustice wasn't the crime itself, but the failure to appreciate its elegance, the way a watchmaker might bristle if you dismissed years of craftsmanship because the strap was scratched. And I understand that reaction more than I probably should, because stripped of morality for a moment, which I realise is a dangerous sentence to start. There is something undeniably compelling about a crime that succeeds by understanding rather than overpowering. No violence, no threats, just knowledge applied patiently. It raises awkward questions about security, about expertise, about how often we confuse complexity with invulnerability. The Antwerp Vault was a marvel of engineering, but it was also a product of its time. Designed by people who assumed that anyone capable of defeating it wouldn't bother trying because the risks would be too high, the effort too great. What they underestimated was motivation, not greed alone, but curiosity. The desire to prove that something declared impossible was merely difficult. That desire is powerful. It's what drives inventors and artists and, occasionally, very polite criminals with a fondness for planning. There's a moment I keep returning to, reported by investigators but never fully explained. When the vault was discovered, some boxes were left untouched, not because they were empty, but because accessing them would have taken too long. The thieves chose discipline over temptation. They knew when to stop. That restraint tells you everything. This wasn't desperation. This was execution. And yet, for all that control, the downfall came not from a flaw in the plan, but from exhaustion, from the human tendency to relax too soon, to assume that once the hardest part is over, the rest doesn't matter quite as much. A bin bag, a forest, a man walking his dog. It's almost insulting, really. The diamonds themselves, meanwhile, dissolved into the global market with astonishing speed. Cut, recut, sold, resold. A stone taken from a box in Antwerp could now be sitting quietly on someone's finger, admired for its clarity, its fire, its supposed permanence, carrying a history nobody would ever suspect. That anonymity is the diamond's greatest strength and its greatest vulnerability. Unlike art, unlike cash, unlike cars, diamonds don't carry serial numbers. They are value made abstract, which makes them perfect for theft and perfect for forgetting. Sometimes I wonder whether the real success of the Antwerp heist wasn't the money at all, but the demonstration, the proof, the knowledge shared quietly among a certain type of person, that even the most fortified systems can be undone with patience and intelligence. That knowledge doesn't go away when the prison doors close, and that, I think, is why this story refuses to settle into the past. Because the vault was rebuilt, the systems were upgraded, lessons were learned, but somewhere, undoubtedly, someone is studying those lessons, not to be safer, but to be better. And if that thought makes you slightly uncomfortable, good. It should. What happens after a crime like this, once the headlines fade, is usually the most revealing part. The excitement burns off. The narrative simplifies. Mastermind caught. Case closed. Everyone goes home reassured that order has been restored. But the Antwerp Diamond Heist never quite cooperated with that process. It refused to behave like a finished story. Officially, It was solved. There was a trial. There was a sentence. There were photographs of a vault door yawning open like a violated mouth. But beneath that neat surface sat a growing sense that what had been uncovered was only a fragment of something larger. And that fragment didn't explain itself easily. Investigators knew this too. Privately, many of them admitted the case bothered them. Not because they'd failed outright, but because success felt incomplete. Like arresting the driver after a bank robbery and realizing the architect of the whole thing never even sat in the car. Nota Bartolo's conviction rested on strong evidence, but it didn't illuminate the whole network, and he, for his part, never filled in the gaps. He didn't trade names for leniency. He didn't unravel under pressure. He maintained a kind of stubborn opacity that feels almost old-fashioned now, in an era where everyone seems desperate to be known. There's a certain discipline in that silence. What little we do know about the others comes from inference. The alarm specialist, for example. Someone had to understand not just how the systems worked in theory, but how they behaved in practice, how sensitive they really were, how often they false triggered, where the tolerances lay. That sort of knowledge doesn't come from manuals. It comes from testing, repeatedly, quietly. Then there was the lock expert. The safe deposit boxes weren't cracked with brute force. They were opened cleanly, efficiently, no damage, which suggests an intimacy with locks that borders on affection. The kind of person who doesn't see a lock as an obstacle, but as a conversation waiting to happen. And then there's the planner, the one who decides when to act, how long to stay, what to take, what to leave. The person who looks at a vault full of unimaginable wealth and says, "No, we stop now, we leave now." Because survival matters more than abundance. That role is rarely glamorous, but it's essential. Without it, greed creeps in. Mistakes multiply. The night stretches too long. When I think about the heist now, I don't picture a group of men hunched over diamonds. I picture someone checking a watch, calculating margins, making peace with imperfection. The Belgian press, in the years that followed, tried to turn the story into something more digestible. Comparisons to Hollywood films, gentle ribbing about European security, a sort of embarrassed humour that masked genuine discomfort. Because the truth was awkward. The diamond trade had been humbled by people who played by its own rules better than it did. There's also something deeply unfashionable about this crime. No violence, no ideology, no manifesto, just competence. It doesn't fit neatly into our preferred categories of villainy. There's nothing to condemn loudly, which leaves you in the irritating position of having to think. And thinking is work. One detail that often gets overlooked is how long the preparation phase likely lasted. Years, not months. The rental of office space alone suggests a commitment most criminals wouldn't tolerate. Showing up, paying bills, making small talk, attending meetings, all in service of a future night that might never come if the conditions weren't right. That level of delayed gratification is rare. It's more commonly associated with careers than crimes. I sometimes wonder how many times they aborted the plan. Nights when something felt off. A guard lingered too long. A censor behaved oddly. Someone was ill. Someone had doubts. Walking away after investing that much time requires a particular kind of discipline. The ability to treat even the perfect opportunity as optional. That mindset is probably what saved them, more than any gadget or trick. After Notarbartolo's release, interest in the case flared up again briefly. Documentaries, podcasts, reenactments. He appeared older, greyer, still withholding. He spoke about injustice, about being misunderstood, about having paid a price for things he didn't do. I don't know whether I believe him. I don't know if that's even the right question. What matters more to me is that the core mystery remains intact. The diamonds are gone. The techniques are known in outline, but not in detail. The people who carried them out returned to anonymity, which is the true mark of success in their profession. And the vault? The vault is still there. Stronger now, smarter. Probably bristling with redundancies layered on top of redundancies, but it carries a memory, an institutional flinch, a quiet awareness that certainty is provisional. Every system carries that now, whether it admits it or not. I think that's why this story endures, not because of the money, impressive though it was, but because it punctured a fantasy. The fantasy that enough steel and sensors can remove uncertainty from the world. That if you plan thoroughly enough, you can eliminate surprise. The Antwerp Diamond Heist was a reminder that surprise doesn't need force. It just needs understanding. And somewhere, maybe in a cafe in Italy or Belgium or somewhere less romantic, someone who was there that night is stirring a coffee, unrecognized, carrying a memory that can never quite be shared. The knowledge of what it felt like to stand inside that vault, surrounded by silence and value and risk, and to know, briefly, that the world's rules had bent, not broken, bent. That distinction matters. At some point, if you sit with this story long enough, the mechanics start to recede and something quieter takes their place. The tools blur, the sensors become abstractions. What you're left with is motivation, which is always the slipperiest part of any crime, and the part we're least honest about. It's easy to say money, and of course, money matters. Diamonds are a very efficient way of converting risk into freedom, but money alone doesn't explain the scale of patience involved here. If you're just greedy, there are faster ways to get rich and faster ways to get caught. This was something else, something closer to obsession. Not obsession in the frothing, manic sense, but the slow, orderly kind. The type that settles in quietly and rearranges your priorities without raising its voice. The type that makes you willing to live a double life for years, not for thrills, but for alignment, for the satisfaction of a plan executed exactly as imagined. I think that's what draws me back to the Antwerp heist more than anything else. The absence of chaos. Crime is usually messy, emotional, reactive. This wasn't. This was someone, or several someones, deciding that the world could be treated like a puzzle and then solving it. That idea is seductive, whether we admit it or not, because most of us spend our lives navigating systems we didn't design and barely understand. Bureaucracy, finance, technology. We're trained to accept friction as inevitable, forms that don't make sense, rules that contradict themselves, doors that won't open no matter how politely you knock. The Antwerp thieves didn't accept that. They assumed there was a logic underneath the irritation, and that if you understood it well enough, the door would open. And it did. There's an uncomfortable mirror there. We like our criminals loud and stupid because it flatters us. It reassures us that wrongdoing is a failure of character rather than competence. But the Antwerp heist suggests something more troubling, that the same traits we admire in other contexts, discipline, intelligence, patience, can be repurposed without losing their elegance. That's not a moral argument, it's an observation. And observations don't ask permission before making you uneasy. The Belgian authorities, after the dust settled, became noticeably more circumspect in how they talked about the case. Early confidence gave way to a kind of professional humility. They spoke less about catching criminals and more about understanding systems, about closing gaps rather than chasing ghosts. Security experts, too, became more cautious. Absolute claims disappeared from marketing brochures. Impossible quietly retired from the vocabulary. Everything became extremely unlikely, which is the grown-up version of admitting you've been embarrassed. But the thieves themselves never resurfaced. Not in any meaningful way. No tell-all books, no deathbed confessions, no shadowy photographs taken from behind. Just absence. That absence invites projection. It allows myths to form. The perfect crew, the gentlemen thieves, the disciplined Italians who outsmarted the world and vanished back into it. Reality is probably less romantic. Arguments, stress, fear, long nights wondering whether this time you've finally miscalculated. Still, the myth persists because it answers a question people don't like asking directly. What would it take to beat a system designed to beat you? The answer, it turns out, isn't rage or rebellion, it's study. I sometimes think about the vault on the night of the heist, not as a target, but as a classroom. The culmination of years of learning, the final exam. Everything they'd practiced, tested, refined, now applied under real conditions, with real consequences. And like any exam, it wasn't about brilliance in the moment. It was about preparation. The unglamorous accumulation of knowledge, the willingness to be bored when others lost interest. That's a frightening lesson if you generalize it too far. It suggests that the most significant disruptions don't come from people who want to tear systems down, but from people who understand them better than their creators do. People who see not the intention behind a rule, but its edge cases, its loopholes, its assumptions. Every system has assumptions. That's where it breathes. That's where it fails. The Antwerp Diamond Centre assumed that anyone inside the building belonged there. It assumed that layers of security created safety rather than complexity. It assumed that no one would be patient enough to wait years for a single night. Those assumptions weren't stupid, they were human. And humans are predictable in groups. That's the real vulnerability. As for Notar Bartolo, I find him less interesting the longer I sit with the story. Not because he's unimportant, but because he feels like an interface rather than a core. The man who touched the world above ground, the one with a name, a face, a sentence. The others remain shapes, roles, functions. And there's something fitting about that. This was never about individuals in the usual sense. It was about coordination, about people willing to submerge their egos into a shared objective. That's rare anywhere, in crime or otherwise. When people ask whether I admire the Antwerp diamond thieves, I always find the question slightly off. Admiration implies endorsement. I don't endorse them. People lost money. Trust was broken. Consequences rippled outward in ways we can't fully measure. But fascination doesn't require approval. Curiosity doesn't demand moral alignment. What I admire, if that's the word, is the clarity. The way the plan had boundaries. The way it ended cleanly. No escalation. No unnecessary harm. No attempt to become legends. They did the thing, and then they stopped. That's harder than it sounds. Most failures in life and crime happen after the objective has technically been achieved. The extra email, the unnecessary comment, the final drink, the moment you stay 5 minutes too long. The Antwerp heist almost avoided that fate entirely. Almost. And maybe that's the real takeaway. Not that perfection is possible, but that it's fragile, that it exists briefly, precariously, and can be undone by something as mundane as rubbish disposal, which is, in its own way, reassuring. Because for all the brilliance involved, for all the planning and restraint, the story still ends the same way most stories do, with people being people, tired, careless, human. The diamonds vanished, the system adapted, the world moved on. But the idea remained. And ideas, unlike diamonds, don't need vaults to survive. There's a temptation, when a story runs this long, to start looking for a moral. Something neat you can tuck it into, like a box at the back of a drawer. Crime doesn't pay. Pride comes before a fall. Nobody's perfect, all true, all useless. The Antwerp Diamond Heist resists that kind of packaging because it wasn't trying to teach anyone anything. It just happened, quietly, methodically, and then left us to deal with the implications. One of those implications is how rarely we talk about competence when it makes us uncomfortable. We're very good at celebrating it when it builds things, bridges, films, businesses, careers. We're less comfortable acknowledging it when it bypasses structures we rely on for safety. The instinct is to downplay it, to find the error, the fluke, the weak link. And yes, there was a weak link, there always is, but focusing on that alone misses the point. The point is that the weak link was identified years in advance. That's the part that lingers, not the night of the heist, but the nights before it. Hundreds of them. The nights where nothing happened at all. Where someone went home having learned something small and apparently insignificant. The way a guard leaned, the way a door closed, the delay between a sensor triggering and a system responding. Margins measured not in inches, but in seconds. That kind of attention changes you. It has to. You don't maintain it without becoming slightly detached from normal life, from urgency, from the shared rhythms everyone else runs on. While other people rush, you wait. While other people assume, you test. I imagine there were moments when the plan felt less like an ambition and more like a burden. Something that had grown too large to abandon, too intricate to explain. A private universe of logic that only made sense to the people inside it. That's another reason these crimes are so rarely talked about honestly. They're collaborative in a way that most of us never experience. Not teamwork in the corporate sense, with meetings and objectives and mission statements, but a genuine interdependence, where one person's mistake doesn't just reflect badly on them, it ruins everything. Trust at that level is intoxicating and dangerous. After the heist, after the arrest, after the sentence, the world tried to return the story to its proper place, the past. But it never quite stayed there. It pops up every few years in some new format, framed as a puzzle, a cautionary tale, a marvel. And each time the details sharpen a little differently depending on who's telling it. Security professionals see a case study, journalists see a narrative, viewers see a thriller. I see a kind of negative space, a reminder of how much of the modern world runs not on enforcement, but on assumption. We assume people won't wait that long. We assume complexity equals safety. We assume access equals trust. We assume nobody is watching closely enough to notice the seams. Most of the time, those assumptions hold. That's why the system works at all. But once in a while, someone notices the seams and can't unsee them. What strikes me now, years after first reading about the heist, is how small the group likely was. Not just in number, but in footprint. No dramatic lifestyle changes beforehand. No sudden wealth afterward, at least not visibly. No need to be seen enjoying the spoils. That restraint is telling. It suggests the reward wasn't the diamonds alone, but the knowledge that they could do it. That the vault, for all its defences, was ultimately legible, understandable, mortal. If that sounds philosophical, it probably is. You don't commit to something like this without drifting into philosophy at some point. You start asking yourself what systems really are, whether authority is inherent or merely procedural, whether rules exist because they're right or because most people agree not to challenge them. These are not questions that make you happier, incidentally, but they do make you precise. The Antwerp Diamond Heist didn't collapse faith in the diamond trade, but it did dent its aura. It reminded everyone involved that value is only as secure as the structures protecting it, and those structures are designed by people with limited imaginations. Not because they lack intelligence, but because imagining every possible misuse is exhausting and expensive. Security, like everything else, is a compromise. And compromises are where interesting things happen. I think about the vault sometimes as it exists now, reinforced, updated, monitored by systems that would have seemed futuristic in 2003. Somewhere deep inside it, though, is the ghost of that night, not in any literal sense, but as a kind of institutional memory. A scar that doesn't hurt anymore but still pulls when the weather changes. Anyone who works there knows the story. They know what happened when the assumptions failed. That knowledge changes behavior, makes people a little more alert, a little less complacent, which is probably the best outcome you can hope for after something like this. The thieves didn't destroy the system. They improved it. That's another uncomfortable truth. And then there's us, the observers, the ones who watch and read and listen from a safe distance, reassured by the fact that this was rare, that it happened somewhere specific to someone else. We treat it like a legend because legends are easier to handle than lessons. But the lesson, if you insist on extracting one, is simple and deeply inconvenient. Systems don't fail because they're attacked. They fail because they're understood. The Antwerp Diamond Heist wasn't an act of defiance. It was an act of literacy. And literacy, once acquired, doesn't go away. I don't know where the remaining members of that group are now. I don't know what they do with their days. Maybe they retired. Maybe they applied their skills elsewhere. Maybe they're just ordinary men who occasionally remember a night when everything aligned and then quietly return to their routines. That anonymity feels right, almost necessary, because this was never about fame. Fame is noisy, sloppy. It attracts attention, which attracts mistakes. This was about alignment, about moving through a world of obstacles as though they were suggestions rather than barriers. And that idea, whether we like it or not, has a long shelf life. The older I get, the less interested I am in the moment of impact. The explosion, the reveal, the gasp. Those are for other people. What stays with me now are the aftershocks. The way an event continues to ripple long after everyone has agreed to stop looking at it. The Antwerp Diamond Heist has those ripples. They're subtle. You won't see them unless you know where to look. A security protocol rewritten in passive language. A new redundancy layered onto an already absurdly redundant system. A pause, half a second too long, when someone says the word secure and realizes they mean secure for now. That's the legacy. Not fear, not admiration, just awareness. There's a line that comes up again and again in interviews with people connected to the diamond trade after 2003. They don't say it outright, but you can hear it underneath the phrasing. A recognition that certainty is a posture, not a state. Something you adopt because the alternative is exhausting. The thieves understood that exhaustion. They exploited it. What I find most unsettling, in a very quiet way, is how transferable the lesson is. This wasn't about diamonds, really. Diamonds were just the medium. The real subject was complexity, and the comforting lie that complexity equals safety. It doesn't. It just means there's more to learn. That's true everywhere. Finance, technology, infrastructure, even relationships, if you want to stretch the metaphor far enough. We pile on rules, safeguards, routines, convinced that each layer makes failure less likely. Sometimes it does, Sometimes it just creates blind spots where no one thinks to look. The Antwerp vault didn't fail because it was poorly designed. It failed because it was designed by people who assumed that anyone capable of understanding it wouldn't choose to break it. That assumption is the softest part of any hard system. I sometimes imagine the moment after the thieves left. The door closed, the alarms reset, the vault returned to its normal, perfect silence. For a few hours everything was exactly as it should be. The system believed in itself right up until the morning it was forced to look in the mirror. There's something almost poetic about that delay. By the time the crime was discovered, it was already over. No chance to intervene, no heroics, just damage assessment. That's another reason it lingers in the mind. It denies us the comfort of intervention. There was nothing anyone could have done in the moment. The work had been done years earlier. We like stories where the ending hinges on a split-second decision. This one doesn't. It hinges on consistency. And consistency, frankly, is boring until it isn't. As for the diamonds themselves, I've stopped thinking of them as stolen. That implies an ongoing state, a wrong waiting to be righted. In reality, they're just elsewhere now. Recut, resold, recontextualized. The physical atoms haven't changed, just the story attached to them. Someone, somewhere, owns one of those stones and has no idea. They might admire it under restaurant lighting. They might insure it. They might pass it on. The diamond will outlast them, carrying a history nobody can see. That feels like an appropriate metaphor for the whole affair. Invisible, persistent, slightly uncomfortable. I don't romanticize the thieves, but I do respect the discipline it took to disappear, to not revisit the scene, to not talk too much, to not correct the record, to let the story harden into whatever shape the world needed it to take. In a culture that rewards constant self-disclosure, that restraint feels almost alien. Maybe that's why the Antwerp Diamond Heist still feels modern, not because of the technology involved, but because of the mindset, the refusal to seek validation, the understanding that the cleanest victories are the quietest ones. There's a moment, late at night, when I sometimes imagine one of them hearing the story retold, in a documentary, a podcast, a YouTube video perhaps, hearing details get slightly wrong, motivations simplified, timelines compressed, and choosing not to care. Because the truth, the real truth, lived somewhere else. In preparation, in waiting, in the calm knowledge that they had already moved on long before anyone else realized what had happened. That's not arrogance. That's closure. The vault stands, the diamonds circulate, the world spins on its usual axis. Nothing visibly broke. And yet, something shifted, a fraction of a degree, maybe, enough to matter. I think that's why I keep returning to this story. Not for the spectacle, but for the reminder that beneath the noise and certainty and steel doors of the modern world, everything still runs on understanding. And understanding, once gained, has a way of opening doors you were never meant to notice. The Antwerp Diamond Heist wasn't loud. It wasn't violent. It didn't demand attention, it earned it. And then it left, which, in the end, feels exactly right.